Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you are allowing your faith to shape your politics or is your politics shaping your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson, and let me introduce you to our roundtable of regularly scheduled panelists. First, we have Mr. Todd McFarland, the Associate General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Tim Schultz, the President of the First American Partnership, a nonpartisan organization dedicated to protecting religious freedom for Americans of all faith. We have Dr. Lawrence Brown, who is the Assistant Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Northeastern Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Dr. Timothy Golden, Professor of Philosophy at Walla Walla University. Gentlemen, welcome to our show, and let's just jump into segment one. Segment one is talking about the Equality Act and the Fairness for All Act. Gentlemen, let me know where are we and help me to understand what's going on with this particular piece of legislation. The Biden administration said it was going to be one of their top priorities, but it seems to be lagging. Todd, give us a little bit of flavor on what's going on with that.
Sure. Well, the Equality Act, which is a bill that would introduce sexual orientation, gender identity across the board in civil rights legislation, appears to have stalled in the Senate. While there is support for it, there are some problems with the bill. It particularly has impact on abortion. It has a complete lack of religious liberty protections. And right now, it does not appear to be a bill that is going anywhere, at least in its current form.
You know, the LGBTQ community is saying that this is a bill that they need in order to get some real fairness. So the reality is how do we get ready to do that with the piece of legislation installed? Where do we go from that? Tim, what do we do?
Well, I think that there's still a deal to be made, and I think that probably runs through moderate senators like Senator Susan Collins and others in the Senate. But I think that it would have to really take a good look at some of these religious liberty concerns, some of the abortion mandate concerns, especially the fact that the Equality Act in its current form would take away the rights of faith-based colleges, for instance, to receive federal financial aid. It would strip school lunch money away from many Christian and other parochial schools. Those are just extreme provisions. So I think that there are ways to protect LGBT people from unjust discrimination without destroying a lot of civil society in the process.
Well, Dr. Golden, so how do we fix this? We've got this legislation that's called FFA. Maybe there are things that can take place. What does that end up cleaning up with this legislation?
Well, I think what's happening here is the difference between theory and practice. You have the idea that in public policy, you have to get all the stakeholders to the table. You have to create an environment that's conducive to negotiation and good faith and getting things done. And the problem is that it's stalled because our politics are so polarized. And with this being an election year, we have midterm elections coming up in November. It's likely that this is just going to remain stalled where it is, at least until a year from now, perhaps, when there may be some movement on it. But we have to sit back and wonder how soon that movement is going to occur. So it's a good thing to see that we've had some movement, but if our politics stays the way it is, and there's every reason to believe that it will, I think this is just going to continue to remain stalled.
You know, I agree with Dr. Golden that our politics probably are going to remain the way it is for a long time. But Dr. Brown, you're up there in the Northeast area where a lot of these issues come up regularly, and our churches are trying to make sure that they continue to be protected. What do you see happening, and what are you hoping the impact will be with this type of legislation?
Well, I'm going to tell you what the real issue is. The real issue is that whether people want to admit it or not, people on both sides of the discussion tend to want to have an outsized positioning in the whole thing. In other words, rather than everyone trying to figure out how we can kind of stand together here and make it work for everybody, people tend to, want to flail their arms and just have this outsized impact on everything. And that's never going to work. Folks have to be willing to say, we can figure out how to kind of stand and how to position ourselves so that there's room for everybody in the room. But as long as everybody's trying to take up all the space, yeah, Houston, we got a problem.
But the reality is everybody always wants to take up all the space. The LGBTQ community wants to take up space. Churches want to take up space. Politicians are going to be looking to do some different things. We're trying to figure out, is there a deal to be had? And it sounds like it may not be this year during an election time, but I also know the LGBTQ community is not happy with status quo, so somebody's going to have to give. So, Todd, where do you think the give and take is actually going to take place if we are going to see a deal and the Biden administration gets to kind of claim a victory here?
Well, whether or not they get to claim a victory is really going to depend on the leadership they're willing to give, right? So the current version of the Equality Act, forget the filibuster, which requires 60 senators, they could not get 50 to, vote for it right now, and with a Harris breaking a tie. Not with issues like abortion mandate being in the bill, and not with the complete lack of religious liberty protections. Something that they've been, quite frankly, unwilling to actually acknowledge exists, but which I think over time, senators and others have begun to realize the true impact of the bill as they looked at it more carefully. There's a couple of different options. One is to fix the problems, right? And fairness for all, or at least the concepts behind it, does that. It provides a good balance of religious liberty protections. It fixes the abortion mandate problem. It fixes the other issues. And it provides a significant amount of protection for LGBT individuals in the country that doesn't currently exist. And so that could be a middle ground, but it's really going to require the advocates on both sides, quite frankly, but especially on the left, to be willing to come to the table, which to date they really have not been willing to do.
I've had some conversations with leadership at the Human Rights Commission that's really involved in this piece of legislation, and I do know that they're trying to figure out how to get there. If we look at it from their perspective, they're thinking that we need some changes because they are dealing with discrimination at very high levels in a lot of different places. What can we do to make sure that they are protected and our religious beliefs are protected all at the same time? So, Dr. Golden, is there a happy medium? Is there a place in there where probably we could all decide to just get along and they will be protected and churches will feel protected?
I think there is a happy medium, but as Todd said a moment ago, both sides have to show some leadership and some good faith when it comes to getting to that happy medium. One of the real challenges of public policy is that you have to give up some of your ideological commitments, as strong as they may be. And so you sort of come to the table and you say, okay, we want to get this done, left, right, and then there's a middle, and you have to approach the middle in a very pragmatic way, and you have to walk away knowing that at least you got something. You may not have got everything you wanted, but it was enough to take a step forward. And I think we have to be willing to give up some of our ideological commitments for the sake of sound public policy.
Dr. Brown, I think one point that's important is that there's always this kind of conversation that the religious community does not care about anything that doesn't directly impact them. But I think it's safe to say that even the religious community is very interested in looking out for the rights of all individuals, including the LGBTQ community. But it sounds like what we're really concerned with is making sure that whatever their concerns are don't necessarily infringe upon our religious beliefs. Do I have that right, or just help me understand?
And therein lies the rub. The bottom line is that we've all inherited basically an environment right now, and to some extent we've all helped to create an environment right now where rather than folk trying to operate from a mindset that says, let's figure out what's going to work for everybody, instead, everyone is afraid that with all the steam that's been injected into this engine, the other side is always looking to seize upon something that was done to use that as a sword instead of a shield. So until everybody in the room agrees to stop trying to be federal prosecutor and look at every little thing that's said and done, we're going to have a problem trying to get there, but we can get there, I believe it.
Tim, Schultz, I'm going to give you the last word on this. So if we were to say what I could see, maybe one or two things flipping on one side and one or two things flipping on the other side that may get us there, what would you say they are?
Well, I think it would need to be on the left an understanding that you can't create a federal mandate for federal funding of abortion and that you have to broadly protect religious freedom, particularly the rights of faith-based institutions to continue to participate on the same terms that they participate right now and before something like this passes. I think on the right, it would have to be an acknowledgement that protecting LGBT people from discrimination is just and important in the first place. Of course, many sort of traditional religious groups have signed public documents saying something like that.
Yeah.
But I think that it's a question of whether that is in the interest of politicians on the right. And I think that question is still very much an open one.
All right, well, we're going to have to close off with that and move on to segment 2, but I appreciate that conversation. Let's move on to segment 2. Segment 2 is we're starting to see a lot of issues regarding Voting Rights Act. The federal government has been trying to put something through Congress that's been very difficult. We find that this is an issue that seems to be impacting our country more from a regional perspective. But Texas actually got very aggressive, where Governor Abbott actually ended up putting a piece of legislation in place, and they are moving forward with it. And with elections coming up fairly soon, I wanted to get an idea of how is this really going to impact us. Dr. Golden, why don't we start off with you? Tell me a little bit about this Texas Voting Rights Act and where we think this may end up, and if we're looking at probably other states maybe doing something similar.
Well, like it or not, Chief Justice John Roberts opened Pandora's box nearly 9 years ago in the Shelby County, Alabama case, when you essentially gut the Voting Rights Act by doing away with the pre-clearance requirement. You open the floodgates for the sort of mischief making that we've seen from southern states with a history of racial discrimination in voting practices. Indeed, it wasn't long after the Shelby County decision in 2013 that a federal judge from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit in North Carolina, one of the most conservative circuits in the country, said that North Carolina's new voting restrictions targeted African Americans, quote, with surgical precision. So this is the kind of thing that we're seeing now. As far as Texas is concerned, they have made it their business to remove authority from local elector bodies. They have cut down the windows for early voting that make it easier for many people to vote several weeks before the election. And so these are the sorts of problems, and a lot of these problems are happening in areas that are heavily across the state, areas like Harris County, which is Houston, Texas, which are heavily African American, right? So it's important to point this out too. African Americans have had their right to vote protected in federal law for a grand total of 48 years in American history, from 1965 until 2013. So what we see today is nothing more than a reversion to a pre-1965 era in which the right to vote of African Americans is imperiled as much now as it was then. And I think Chief Justice John Roberts, as he reflects on his career on the bench, may leave the Supreme Court regretting making the decision that he made in the Shelby County case based on federalism principles, saying that the Voting Rights Act was too much federal power. I think what we're seeing now in Texas is evidence that maybe the Voting Rights Act does not have enough power. And
no, Todd, but let me ask you this, Todd.
For a long time.
Todd, let me ask you, though, what's wrong with a state just deciding to do what it'd like to do? I mean, everyone should have the power to kind of decide what works regionally for them. Is this a problem for Texas? And if all states decide to do something a little bit different, what's the impact? What's the downside?
Well, so I think there's a couple of things going on here. So first of all, just to be clear, the Supreme Court did not strike down the pre-clearance procedure. What they simply said was that they couldn't rely on 1960s era data, right? And so it was out of date. It had not been updated in any way. It applied to parts of the country that didn't really
Which has the practical effect of gutting the pre-clearance procedure, because if you can't use the formula, you can't use pre-clearance.
So what they can do is update the formula and update the data, right? And Congress has not done that. So it doesn't get rid of pre-clearance. What it says is Congress needs to do its job. I think the second issue that goes on is, I think you have to ask yourself, are they targeting people because of their race, or are they targeting them because of their political affiliation. And this also gets to redistricting, which is a little bit different than the voting rights. And I think the overwhelming, all of these claims are not showing racial bias, right? They're all based on disparate impact. They're all saying, and I think there's a good argument to be made that what they're targeting are Democratic voters, not Black voters. Now, what happens in America is because Democrats vote, or Black people vote Democratic in the high 90s, and depending on the election, depending on who's running, for Democrats, there tends to be a 1-to-1 ratio. So, you can talk about the disenfranchisement. I don't think we're looking at a pre-1964. People vote, Black people vote. They helped Biden become a president. And so I really don't think you're looking at sort of the cataclysmic event that some people have tried to describe it. Instead, I think you see a state doing what all states do, is that set up their elections the way they see fit. And Democratic states do the exact same thing. And the people in power do it to benefit themselves. And I don't think there's anything going on different in Texas than you would see in a blue state. It's
Tim
just
Schultz, you got to tell me, do you buy this, what Todd has given us here today? What's your thoughts on that?
So I think that there's two things about this. I'm not an expert on this area of law, but what it's obvious to me is that if you say that they're targeting people on the basis of political ideology, not race, but then there's a sort of concentrated effect on the Black voters, it kind of is a distinction without a difference, right?
Yep.
Your motive may be really bad or just kind of bad, but either way, if the end result is you're targeting Black voters' ability to vote, it's a problem. The second thing is that I think that Todd is right that there's always essentially taking advantage to your best possible degree. Each state does that. My home state of Maryland has ridiculous redistricting and gerrymandering to benefit the Democratic Party because it's a state by Democrats. But I think that that's morally different because of the history, right? It's morally different because of the history. There's all kinds of advantage taking in elections and the way that election rules are brought. But I think the history of Jim Crow, the history of how, the right to vote for Black Americans was won with blood. The fact that, as Dr. Golden correctly says, it wasn't until 1965 and then to 2013, the law changed. I think that there is there's just a difference to this kind of thing compared to ordinary, for lack of a better term, electoral advantage positioning.
Yep. Dr. Brown, I'm trying to figure out from your perspective. You're up there in the Northeast, you're hearing about these laws down in Texas, restriction of voting rights, and the impact of what happens from a church perspective. Where are we from a church perspective as far as you're concerned, and how do you think we ought to be thinking about this? And are you going to be comfortable in that neck of the woods when you start seeing this type of legislation in other areas?
Well, here's why it's troubling from a church perspective. When people from both parties stood up and essentially said, this has been one of the best run and most fair elections that we've had in a long time. And that's a statement made with huge numbers of people from both sides actively engaged in the process. So when leaders from both sides, whether they be secretaries of state or whatever the case may be, stand and in a nonpartisan way say, this was one of the best run elections we've ever seen. And then the reaction to that is to now implement all of these draconian steps. It makes me wonder if they had said, man, this was awful. We had all kinds of problems. We got to fix this joker. That would be different. But how is it that you find as an appropriate response implementing these rules, which, whether you want to admit it or not, essentially make it more difficult for someone to vote as opposed to making it easier for someone to vote? How do you justify doing that when literally everyone across the country who had something to do about it said, well, we got this one right. And from a moral standpoint, that's the problem. And that's the issue. Because the only thing that I could find that really bends some people out of shape is that the guy that they wanted to win didn't. And I'm sorry, that's not a justification for now implementing all of these massive changes, foundational changes, when people are saying, well, we got this one right. So there's a disconnect there, and that's a problem.
I'm going to have to let that be the last word on this, gentlemen, but this is obviously an issue that we're going to be talking about, and we're going to move right on to segment 3. Segment 3 has taken us to probably a topic that seems to be impacting all of the United States, vaccine mandates. And the Biden administration has been trying to do everything it believes it needs to do regarding battling COVID. And one of the things they came up with was this vaccine mandate. They decided they were going to put a proposal in place regarding the OSHA regulations. And as a result, what has ended up happening, the Supreme Court stepped in, and it basically looked like it almost went back on a decision it might have had back in 1905. But now it looks like they tried to split the baby in some way on that. Timmy Schultz, can you come in and tell me a little bit about what was going on with the OSHA rules in the Supreme Court and how that decision kind of has us moving forward now?
Yeah, I mean, the question really is a question of regulatory authority. Does OSHA have the power under its sort of mandate from Congress to impose the vaccine mandate that they did impose? And I think the Supreme Court said no. Of course, this court, as being a more conservative court, takes a dimmer view of the regulatory authority of federal administrative agencies. They said Congress did not give this administrative agency, OSHA, the power to do something this aggressive.
Right.
And so I think that's the area of law that I think gets lost on people a little bit.
So when you look at the decision that came down, the decision came down where pretty much it said, let's keep the mandates in place for the frontline healthcare workers, but everybody else you basically are saying, that's gone a little bit too far. I mean, do we have a little bit of splitting the baby here or a little bit of confusion here? Todd, what is your thoughts on that, and where do you think we're going with this?
So, I think it's important to remember, and Tim is right, you've got to look at where the source of government authority comes from. What's known as the CMC mandate with Centers for Medicare, CMS mandate, that comes from Congress's spending authority, right? It says if you want to take federal money, you've got to abide by certain rules. Of course, if you're a healthcare provider, almost all of them take federal money. OSHA was just a pure regulation. Like you could have no interaction with the federal government other than just being an employer with over 100 employees. And this requirement was there. And what the Supreme Court said is that OSHA's power to impose this was not as much as the power through the spending clause to impose these requirements. And, that seems like whether you agree with it or not, a rational sort of distinction that you're making here. So it wasn't really made so much about healthcare versus non-healthcare. It all really had to do with Congress's power, and that is through the regulatory power, and that was through the spending clause.
So, Dr. Brown, let me ask you this. We've got the Supreme Court weighing in. They're saying that this group has got to have this particular situation move forward the way it has been. But then we have another group and that has been a position where vaccine mandates aren't necessary. From a church perspective, though, it seems as though that battle that's happening on the outside is also happening on the inside. Have you been noticing that in your area?
Oh, very much so, very much so. I have to tell you that I finally got to a place where the Lord helped me understand that my sanity was more important than my getting a victory on certain things. I was a pastor of a very large church with a lot of senior members. And so my natural instinct was, what can we do to keep you folks alive? So for me, battling the problem via vaccine made a lot of sense. But for a lot of people, because of the misinformation that's out there, they were against it. So finally, folks were like, Pastor Brown, we love you, but you got to stop talking about this. So I took their advice and I did stop talking about it. But the reality is that when you think about the sheer impact that all of this has had on our lives, folks, like it or not, the numbers still tell a very compelling story. And it doesn't matter what side of the argument you're on. The very compelling story is, if you look at who's filling hospitals, if you look at who's dying, they all tend to have one thing in common. And that's a very compelling number, no matter how you feel about vaccine mandates.
But at the end of the day, Dr. Golden, this is the reality. This is America. People get to choose to do what they want to do. We call ourselves the land of the free, the home of the brave. Is there an issue where if people decide we don't want to go down this road personally, despite maybe even what the end results may be, why is it so important in this particular administration to hopefully do something different to potentially impose a regulation on people who may just simply say, I don't care. I just want to live the life the way I do? Tim, kind of help me understand that.
Well, I think it's important to understand that there's two legal issues here, right? There's an individual rights issue, which is what you referenced in your question. But then there's this other issue of administrative authority, right? To what extent does the federal government have the authority to mandate? And so I think the issue of governmental authority aside, when you look at the individual rights side of this issue, I think the law is pretty clear that your claims to an individual right, to your bodily integrity are not going to trump the interest in public health. So that's sort of where we are with this. I mean, Supreme Court seems to have been pretty consistent at not being as interested in individual rights issues as they have been in issues regarding governmental authority or scope of administrative power.
Well, Todd, it looked as though what ended up happening is there were many that thought that the Supreme Court may fall in line with the idea it's all about public safety here. And with the public safety being first and foremost, then we're going to make any decision to keep mandates in place. But I have to agree, I think it probably was a very balanced approach as to how they looked at this. And many people were talking about the conservatives versus the left. But in reality, it probably was, I guess, just a decision that just simply made sense and seemed somewhat balanced. What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, we do, unfortunately, in society, like to look at the Supreme Court through a partisan lens, which sometimes is accurate, but other times is not. Here, there were legitimate concerns about the power of the federal government. They made reference to a Supreme Court decision from the early part of the 20th century that said that vaccine mandates were constitutional. There's a couple of things to remember there. First of all, that was a state mandate, not a federal. And we do still have a federal system of government that gives states public health authority more than the federal government. And the other issue is, first of all, especially for OSHA, it wasn't a mandate. It was a mandate or test. It only applied to employees with 100 employees or more. So, I think at the end of the day, the Supreme Court was looking at this as a regulatory matter. And just to be clear, Congress, if there was the political will, could pass this. They didn't say that the Congress couldn't mandate this. They just said it couldn't be done regulatory. And, for better or worse, we still live in a democracy, and the people in this country are not behind this. And if they were behind it, then Congress could have and would have passed it, but they're not.
Todd, I'm going to have to let that be the last word on this. This is a conversation we could go on with forever. But we're going to wrap up our show here, and we've gone through some interesting topics. We've got a lot of activity going on in the future. So I'm just going to go around the horn, and each one of you just take a little minute to just kind of tell me quickly something that maybe I just don't know. Todd, tell me something I don't know.
Well, I don't know what you don't know, Orlin. But, I think, as we sort of, go into the midterm elections, and as we, then, we've got to be looking at a situation where we're not governing from these extremes. Congress, we talk about their inability to do things, and that's been from beginning to end. And somehow we've got to get back to a place where we can govern and not just stand on polemics.
Lawrence, tell me something I don't know.
Well, you may know this, but based on the dialogue that I've been hearing across the spectrum, I think what a lot of people don't know is that while generally speaking, the power of the government tends to be curtailed, in an emergency, when things get really bad, the government is allowed to make some calls that they don't typically get to make. And I think that's been lost sight of because everyone is talking about, well, no one gets to tell me what to do. Well, when things are really, really bad, yeah, someone does kind of get to tell you what to do.
Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
It's hard, Orland, because I've thought for you for so long as a nearly omniscient individual.
Understood.
What I would say is that there's so much research now that people's political ideologies are taking on a heightened status in their lives. They're taking on a kind of almost quasi-religious status in their lives. And that makes compromise and getting rid of your ideology and being pragmatic very hard. And that's true about a range of issues, whether it's LGBT rights and religious rights, or whether it's vaccines and sort of public health. People are placing too much onto their political ideology. It makes sort of problem solving very difficult.
Dr. Golden, I'm going to end with you. Tell me something I don't know, Tim.
Here's something you don't know, Orland. I would tell you now that President Biden's Supreme Court nominee will be far more conservative than any of us expect.
Wow.
Despite her identity as a Black woman, she will be much more conservative and much more toward the center than any of us are expecting. So look out for that.
Great. Well, gentlemen, thanks a lot for a great show. I appreciate all that information, and hopefully we'll have you back very soon on Faith and Politics. We just want to thank everybody for being here with us. This was a great opportunity for us to be here. So if it's about God and government, it's Faith and Politics. See you next time.